Hello, everyone. Welcome to ISD's webinar, Why Does the Green Recovery in Canada Need to be Fossil Fuel Subsidy Free? Thanks so much for taking the time on this Wednesday morning. Some of you it's evening or very early morning to join us. I'm Vanessa Corkle. I'm a policy analyst on ISD's energy team based in Ottawa. And today's webinar is going to focus on how exploring tackling subsidies in Canada can help us recover from COVID-19. We have a great lineup of speakers that I'm really excited to be sharing this webinar with. But before we begin, I'm just going to give a couple of housekeeping notes. We have disabled the chat, but if you have technical problems or if you have questions for us, please don't hesitate to send us a note through the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. My colleagues Jonas, Mustafa, and Phil are also on hand from ISD to support. So how today will work is that we're going to have each of our speakers give about a 7-minute intervention on their topics of their expertise. And then we're going to move to a moderated open discussion with some pre-formulated questions that ISD is leading for about 20 minutes. And then we're going to open up to questions from you. So please feel free. You don't have to wait until the end to put questions in. If you think of something when a speaker is speaking, we'll keep a tally of those and open it up at the end. So just a bit of an introduction as to why we put this webinar together. We are seeing historic levels of spending worldwide in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of this spending is unfortunately going to support incumbent high carbon sectors, including the fossil fuel industry. And we know that in Canada, the investments that we make now and in the next year or two are going to have long-lasting implications. So ensuring that the way we spend this money is done properly has never been more important, especially as we're dealing with these other crises, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and these ongoing problems of social inequity that we've seen worsened by this pandemic. So I just wanted to quickly share my screen to demonstrate some of the trends we have seen so far. ISD has been working with a number of other international organizations on what's called the Energy Policy Tracker. So I'm just going to move to the next slide here. So this is an initiative that we've done with a number of other international institutions. Currently, we're tracking spending on over 24 countries worldwide. So you can go check that out at energypolicytracker.org. And as you can see, the trend is skewing largely towards fossil energy being supported by policies. And in Canada, this is overwhelmingly the trend. So Bronwyn is going to speak a little bit about that later on. We also wanted to flag that in response to this, ISD and a number of other environmental organizations have been doing a lot of advocacy. So I just wanted to flag that our Green Strings report came out in June, is still getting a lot of pickup. You can download it at the link at the top of that screen. And this was put together with a number of the organizations that we work with, including Climate Action Network, which Kat is here to speak from today. But the principles that we can apply to government spending to ensure green recovery from COVID-19. But I also want to emphasize that this is just one aspect of a just and resilient recovery, and that there's many other groups working on very important work to ensure that we come out of this pandemic stronger than we went in. So I'm not going to go over these principles in detail, but I do encourage those of you who are interested to check out the report online. Feel free to contact us if you're interested in it. These are some principles we outlined that we think would help us limit the number of subsidies we're providing and ensure that we're putting money towards the right industries. So to kick this off, I just wanted to do a poll, a quick temperature check to see what kind of understanding we have amongst our audience today. So I'm going to launch this poll, which hopefully will work. If you could, it should pop up on your screen, and if you can vote on it, we will get a sense of where we are at. Great. Okay. So as you can see, we have a nice mix here today. We have a lot of sort ofs. So that's great. We're going to delve into a little bit about how the G20 review is going and several of our panelists will explain that process. So looks like that will be a good way to start. And then our second poll, hold on here. I'm going to launch this one to see what people think our current levels of subsidies are. Okay, I see polling has stagnated, so I'm going to end it now. Okay. Okay, so the correct answer for this is actually 4.8 billion based on the data that we've been able to collect at ISD. But to those of you who answered 6 billion, I do want to emphasize that we don't actually have data for a lot of the tax measures that are out there, as well as a lot of the finance that's being provided through some of our public finance institutions. So again, some of our panelists will talk a little bit about that in today's webinar. And I am going to now introduce our first speaker. With us, we have Catherine Abreu, who's the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, a coalition of more than 100 organizations operating across Canada. She also works with ISD as part of CANRAC on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies in Canada, and with her team at CANRAC and other civil society groups has really spearheaded the work on just recovery across Canada. So over to you, Kat.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Pleasure to be with you all today. I'm calling in from unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territories in what is also known as Ottawa. And I'm going to just take a few minutes to try to contextualize this really technical conversation that we're about to have on fossil fuel subsidies within the broader context of the crisis we find ourselves in with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the global shock in oil prices. I don't have slides because I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the juicy material on the slides of colleagues moving forward. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about what subsidies are, what they look like, what we're seeing in Canada, because I know that my colleagues are going to cover off that material. Where I want to take us is in thinking about what subsidies mean in terms of the priorities of our governments and our societies. So it's really clear from my perspective that the combined shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic and the crash in global oil prices has forced us into confrontation with a series of vulnerabilities built into our economic and social systems. There are all these crises that lurk behind the health and economic emergencies at hand. And these crises look like inequality in income, wealth, and access to essential services, racial and other forms of discrimination, colonial structures that perpetuate harmful resource and cultural extraction, externalization of environmental harm that underpins climate chaos and ecological collapse. And it's clear that not only are these vulnerabilities, but also in many contexts, they are forms of tremendous violence and destruction. The systems of control, of extractivism, of oppression that thrive on white supremacy and in some instances lead to the brutalization in particular of Indigenous people, Black people, and people of color are the same systems that underline the climate crisis. That's why we always say at Climate Action Network Canada, and this is true for so many of the people that we work with, that the fight to address climate change is fundamentally a fight for justice. And that's also why we work at the systems level, because working at the systems level is the only way to get the transformational change we need to address the climate crisis. Over the course of the pandemic, hundreds of groups from every corner of Canadian civil society have come together to demand a just recovery for all. And this has been an incredible process of hundreds of individuals and organizations gathering to think through what a just recovery means in the context of this land that is often called Canada. Together, we came up with 6 overarching principles that we believe should guide all policy and investment decisions governments make as they look to respond not only to the immediate needs of people during the pandemic, which is absolutely essential, but also as they think about restarting the economy in a way that shields us from the future shocks we know are coming as crises like climate change and their impacts continue to mount. At this point, over 550 organizations from across the country have endorsed the principles. I would really invite you to visit justrecoveryforall.ca. That's where you can find the principles outlined. You can see the incredible graphics that have been developed to communicate those principles. You can also take a look at the parallel French website. There was an incredible process that happened in Francophone communities across Canada to develop those 6 principles in the French language. We also on that website have recordings of an online rally we hosted when we unveiled the principles that had about 3,000 people in attendance, where we delivered those principles to decision makers from every party in Canada. And you can take a look at a webinar that we did on just recovery and anti-Black racism and the intersections between the two. Now, I know I started off talking about these really high level concepts, and I want to assure you that by no means am I here to say that fossil fuel subsidies are a tool specifically of destruction and of racism, for instance. However, fossil fuel subsidies are a symptom of an economic order that is out of balance, an economic order that prioritizes private profit over people and the planet. And that's why eliminating fossil fuel subsidies is, from our perspective, an essential ingredient to a just recovery. With the economic pause forced by COVID-19, we have a chance to correct our current path, because the choices we make in the coming weeks and months will have enormous implications, not only for the near-term health and well-being of Canadians, but also the long-term health and resilience of our society. With the vast and previously unimaginable sums of money currently being spent by governments, we are literally spending tomorrow's money today. And that means we have to use that money to build tomorrow's economy. If governments can deviate from the conventional path that we've seen in the past of pumping funds towards fossil fuel intensive growth plans, and instead pivot towards renewables, towards prioritizing a balance between growth and climate, this pandemic could be an unlikely but much needed shock to spur climate action. And I really want to emphasize here that I think all of us are moved, and many of us are personally affected by the tremendous loss that has come along with this pandemic. And by no means do any of us want to see a silver lining, want to talk about the opportunities that come along with this pandemic. That is not what we're talking about here. We acknowledge the suffering, but we also have to acknowledge what led us to this kind of suffering and use this unprecedented moment to help protect ourselves against this kind of suffering in the future. Because there are investments that we can be making right now to help us avoid some of the irreversible climate tipping points that were outlined by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their landmark report on global warming of 1.5 degrees released in October 2018. We can also use these investments to accelerate the shifts already underway to build a climate safe global economy. And we're seeing some jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, mobilize the scales of investments required to do just that. On the other hand, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about this from the next speakers, the current transition might be hurt if governments instead double down on the polluting status quo in the ways that previous responses to economic crises are emulated. Drawing on a global survey of senior central bank and finance ministry officials, as well as learnings from the 2008 financial crisis, a group of Oxford University economists have cataloged more than 700 stimulus policies into 25 groups and conducted a survey of 231 experts. And on average, these Oxford economists and the experts that they've interviewed saw a green route out of the pandemic as being really highly economically effective. Just as an example, they suggested that clean energy infrastructure construction, which is particularly labor intensive, creates at least twice as many jobs per dollar invested as fossil fuel investments. And Vanessa introduced us at the beginning of the webinar to the Green Strings report, which we and many of our member organizations and allies were instrumental in putting together to make recommendations about principles that should guide the policy and investment decisions being made in the next number of months in Canada. And in that report, you can see some of the work of the Oxford experts reflected, and you can also see some other reflections on the 2008 financial crisis, where we saw that there were huge investments poured into things like building roads, and yet the investments that were poured, the smaller amounts of investments that were poured into things like public transportation tended to create about 70% more jobs. And so if the concern here is about getting people back to work, there are ways that we can get people back to work that also help us build that tomorrow, build the world that we need to be living in. I'm going to be closing up pretty quickly, and I'll just say that we're in this interesting moment in Canada where we have been seeing indications that we'll hear from Bronwyn that the Canadian government is unfortunately, being drawn back into those status quo investments that really double down on the fossil fuel economy. However, we have also seen, or we've at least heard, some commitments from the Canadian government, particularly in the recent throne speech, to build that clean economy that we need. And we've seen a couple of smaller indications that they're willing to put the money on the line to do that. So here we are kind of waiting to see what that ultimate package is going to be, waiting for the next budget, waiting to see whether Canada is going to put its money where its mouth is. And as we wait for it, I just want to leave us all with this quote from an amazing colleague, Hassan Syed, who runs the Migrant Rights Network and who we got to work with through the Just Recovery process. And he said in a webinar that I had the great privilege of being on with him, "Remember, in this moment, it was not corporations or privatization that saved us. Remember that when they tell you otherwise. But what saved us was social services and mutual aid." I'm just going to leave it there. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Kat. And what a great way to start off this webinar and frame it within the broader needs of where we need to be going as a country and as an international community. I'm now going to pass the floor over, or the web platform, over to Bronwyn Tucker, who's an analyst at Oil Change International, where she works on focusing on shifting public finance and subsidies towards a renewable future. She's also our resident expert on Export Development Canada, which is Canada's main institution that currently provides public finance to fossil fuels. And she'll speak a little bit about the trends we've seen with COVID spending so far. Thanks, Bronwyn.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks, Kat, for starting us off. Yeah, really happy to be joining today from Treaty 6 territory, also known as Edmonton, Canada. And yeah, for this overview, I think basically trying to give a check-in on kind of, we're in this moment where we have a really historic levels of stimulus and government spending happening, and wanting to give a check-in on how that's looked from an energy perspective so far. And unfortunately, I think as Kat foreshadowed, I think it hasn't gone in the direction we would hope. And so just bear with me for a second as I share my slides. I'm going to start with the parts of this spending that we can track, and then I'll go on to what we can't. And as Vanessa said, we'll also focus a little bit on Export Development Canada. So yeah, basically some really important context before I get onto the kind of too many numbers that I've put on this slide, is just that, yeah, this number, this kind of 13.6 billion for the oil and gas sector directly that we've been able to track in the energy policy tracker. This is on top of kind of existing fossil fuel subsidies that the poll talked about at the beginning. This is just in new policies that have been put in place since the pandemic. And also a note that Vanessa is the lead on kind of entering and finding the data for this tracker, and we absolutely wouldn't have this really good data without her. So just a big kudos there. And then lastly, just that not every dollar of this that's listed here has an equal impact. Not every dollar of it is what would be defined as a subsidy directly. So a lot of it is public finance. And so these are loans or insurance or other products that are issued from government institutions. And because we don't know the details on these almost ever, we can't say how much of this is a subsidy and how much of it is being given at kind of below market rates. So we count it all. But what I can say is that even the parts that aren't kind of below market are definitely still conferring really important benefits at a time when oil and gas projects are very hard to build. And ultimately, this money is public money, and the public is on the hook for it if it goes under. So I think a good example of this is from this April with a small project called Coastal GasLink Pipeline. There was up to $500 million given to Coastal GasLink from Export Development Canada. And obviously, this is a really hard project to build because it is extremely contentious and has really horrible Indigenous rights violations associated with it. And the public finance kind of given to that project is something that really helps it get over the line at a time when investors globally are really backing away from projects like this. And so, yeah, I think to get to these numbers, I think basically, want to just highlight that, this is even this smaller number, that's 13.6 billion, is still more than 2 times the kind of green portion on this graph that's gone to clean energy and transport. And yeah, as you can see, just also relatively little of it has had conditions put on it. Just going to kind of some of the bigger policies so far, and you can definitely go to Energy Policy Tracker's site and look at these in detail. These were kind of the top 4 that we've seen so far. I've highlighted the unconditional ones here, but just to say definitely some of the kind of conditional spending that's had requirements around methane emissions or well reclamation still have a lot of risks to them, and I think in a lot of ways are still just conferring extra budget support to companies and prolonging their kind of profitability and delaying the just transition ultimately. So yeah, I think basically not the kind of picture for energy spending that we would want to be seeing right now. But I think this is also only just part of it. And so wanting to move on to the parts that we can't track, which I think is almost even a bit more exciting. There's definitely lots of policies in the Energy Policy Tracker that aren't quantified. And to highlight some of them, one is central bank spending. So in the corporate bond program, for example, that's 10 billion. And definitely that program has a really outsized representation of oil and gas companies. And what I want to focus most on is Export Development Canada, which is a federal crown corporation that's been given a really big mandate in recovery. And this was troubling when we first heard it because they're an institution that already provides a ton of oil and gas finance. And so if we think back to this spring, I think there was this moment where we thought maybe that oil and gas would get a really massive bailout package. And I think really as a credit to public pushback, that announcement largely didn't happen and we stopped some of that finance. But as the kind of tracker shows, a lot of this has still happened, just in ways that are maybe less obvious or in smaller packages. And through Export Development Canada, they've been given a larger mandate and much less, the kind of cap on their spending has been raised and is at the discretion now of the finance minister. And so, yeah, this is troubling if we kind of, OCI already has been tracking EDC and they are, because of yeah, because of EDC kind of single-handedly, it's made Canada the largest per capita provider of public finance for fossil fuels out of all the G20 countries. And so you can see our kind of yellow dot on this graph is pretty outsized compared to some of our peers. And so overall, that was kind of in business as usual times. And so, you know, hearing that they are being given a much bigger mandate for COVID recovery, it's something we've been watching. But unfortunately, in terms of being able to track what finance has actually flowed, the transparency is really poor and the reporting's been pretty delayed. And so it's definitely a bit of a black box at this point. We've only been able to find about 1 billion in finance for oil and gas so far this year. And we know, you know, there's still new finance being given to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and that goes through Export Development Canada. EDC has told us directly that we can expect more transactions to show up and that they're just delayed. And so we're yeah, really concerned about the kind of like lack of transparency here. And just to kind of finish off, there is a legislative review currently underway for Export Development Canada that's been stalled for over a year. And so this would, you know, fall under the Ministry of Trade, and it's something they've been able to kind of have die in committee and really not bring forward. But the report for that raised, when it, you know, before it was stalled, the kind of initial inquiry raised a lot of the same concerns around Indigenous rights and climate change and transparency that we have. And so, yeah, in addition to these recommendations from the report that I showed on the previous slide, I think we're also, yeah, pressuring the Trade Committee to get that review unstalled and, you know, finish it. And yeah, I think just lastly to say, I think this public finance and the wider kind of fossil fuel subsidies for Canada, I think have always been concerning, but are extra concerning right now at a time when, you know, we're spending so much more money and really need to be investing in public services and a Green New Deal and a just transition. But instead kind of seeing the same kind of patterns be replicated. And so, yeah, I think just from my vantage point here in Edmonton, would really say, you know, people are, there's an overwhelming feeling and fear that like oil and gas isn't going to be able to carry us going forward and shouldn't because of all the impacts. But really just not seeing leadership or an alternate plan from government. And so really, yeah, excited to see a lot of the like civil society campaigns and organizations pushing for otherwise. And I think, yeah, I think fossil fuel subsidies are a great one to point to because this money could be used for literally anything else and be much better. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bronwyn. And just remember to stop sharing your screen on your end when you have a minute. Thanks so much for that. So I just want to, before we dive into our next speaker, just wanted to do a quick overview of where Canada is at with the G20 peer review. So Canada agreed in 2009, along with other G20 countries, to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in the medium term. So we get hooked on a lot this word of inefficient, and what does that mean? And then later on, Canada agreed with the G7 countries to phase out inefficient subsidies by 2025. So we have this deadline of 2025. And then last year, Canada began undergoing a peer review of its fossil fuel subsidies with Argentina. So this process, basically Canada is expected to do a self-review of its own subsidies and then basically swap the review with Argentina, and then they review each other's subsidies. And this is an example of how international cooperation is key to getting countries on board to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, but also so that we can maintain accountability through international cooperation and to our commitments under these international agreements. So in that spirit, I would like to pass on the mic to His Excellency, Mr. Martin Harvey, who is New Zealand's High Commissioner to Canada Previously, he was chief negotiator in the Trade and Economic Group of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And he's also here representing the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, which is an international coalition of countries who are working to collaborate to phase out and reform fossil fuel subsidies, of which New Zealand is a member. So I will pass it on to him. Thanks.
Thank you. Kia ora tātou. Even though I'm based in Ottawa, I bring you greetings from my countrymen in New Zealand. We are very happy that we were able to participate in this seminar today. Because of course this topic, fossil fuel subsidy reform, is an incredibly important initiative and one that New Zealand has championed internationally for a number of years. It's especially important in the time of COVID-19. We're seeing governments invest heavily in economic recovery and stimulus to counter the effects of the pandemic on our economies. But in effect, because of this, we've shortened the length of time we have to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, as decisions now, of course, may lock in emissions for decades to come. And in this particular, this stimulus to minimize the impacts of COVID-19 is likely to deplete the fiscal headspace that governments will have for the next decade. So it's vital that we get it right now, how we're going to spend our money. But this crisis is also an opportunity. It should encourage governments to look again at priorities and whether the $500 billion US spent annually on fossil fuel subsidies is a sensible public policy choice, which of course it's not. The World Health Organization, the UN Secretary General, and the International Monetary Fund have recently highlighted fossil fuel subsidy reform as important for recovery, with the WTO listing it in its Healthy Recovery Manifesto as one of the 6 prescriptions for a healthy green recovery from COVID-19. A little bit about us. Through our Zero Carbon Act, New Zealand aims to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The Zero Carbon Act sets targets and establishes an independent climate change commission to advise on specific emissions budgets and policies to achieve these targets. So consequently, future governments of whatever colour have been made accountable for their climate actions. We have reformed our emissions trading system to make it fit for achieving our Paris commitments. And we now have a world first agreement with our farmers to price agricultural emissions by 2025. People may know that this is one of the largest parts of our greenhouse gas inventories because of our high number of animals relative to human population. And just this last month, the government announced it'll introduce mandatory climate-related financial disclosures to ensure investments take account of climate risks. All of these moves provide certainty to business about the long-term trajectory of New Zealand, transforming to a low emissions, climate resilient economy that is just and inclusive. This is the platform from which we have and we will be active in advocating internationally for fossil fuel subsidy reform. And I want to touch on 3 ways in which we advocate for this. First, as just mentioned by our convener, New Zealand is a founder of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group. It's an informal group of non-G20 countries aiming to build political consensus on the importance of reform. So other members of the group include Costa Rica, Denmark, Ethiopia, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and Uruguay. Together, we also advocate for reform within the UNFCCC processes and in the WTO. We support peer review of fossil fuel policies through APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the G20. So New Zealand has undergone several peer reviews of our policies through APEC in 2015 and also an OECD review in 2018. While we have no direct support measures, the most recent OECD assessment in 2018 identified 9 policy measures that provide indirect support for fossil fuels. And 3 of these measures have since been terminated, with a further measure in the process of being wound down now. It's interesting to hear about the progress in Canada's peer review. One point that I take from New Zealand's own experience is that that's an iterative process. Removing direct subsidies, peer review, removing indirect support measures, peer review, and so on. The group is advocating for commitment to reform. No one has to be squeaky clean now. New Zealand is not. We want to head in the right direction, and that's the commitment that we're asking other governments to take. New Zealand is also leading a campaign to bring the issue of fossil fuel subsidy reform into the World Trade Organization, which can drive enforceable change. We think that the WTO is the obvious forum through which to achieve disciplines on fossil fuel subsidies. It has the transparency and notification mechanisms, as well as the breadth of membership for effective action. We know that fossil fuel subsidies have a distorting effect on international trade and investment decisions. We also know that committed multilateral action can make it easier for countries to act without fear of losing out to countries that continue to subsidize. Ahead of the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, which will take place in 2021, New Zealand is spearheading a statement for a political commitment to look at avenues to address fossil fuel subsidies in the World Trade Organization. We would really welcome Canada's support for this campaign. And we have been advocating here with the Canadian government to join with us. The Friends have deliberately modelled the statement on language that Canada and others have supported in the G20 and in other fora. I just want to finally just mention one other international trade initiative that New Zealand is part of, which we're hoping member by member that other WTO members might join. It's called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. I should just mention that New Zealand, along with Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland and Norway have launched this. Our aim is that it's a first of its kind agreement to bring together some of the interrelated elements of the climate change, trade and sustainable development agendas. And one important area that it will cover are disciplines to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really useful to understand the movement and momentum we have internationally on this issue. Sometimes we get a bit stuck in Canada thinking that it's just us civil society groups working on this, but really there's a much larger movement worldwide, including from some leading governments and first movers, of which New Zealand is one. So next I would like to pass it over to Ron Steenblick, who is a senior fellow at IASD, but has a wealth of experience on this topic. He was a former special counselor for fossil fuel subsidy reform in the OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate, and he's collaborated with IASD for many years on efforts to increase transparency and document the effects of harmful subsidies, is an expert on what does and does not qualify as a subsidy and how it's measured, and on fossil fuel subsidy review processes, including for the G20. So he'll talk a little bit about how that process works. Over to you.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Vanessa, and greetings to everybody and from the shores of the Seine in Paris. I was going to say palm-lined, but that's a background. The High Commissioner has touched quite a bit on the international processes, so I'll focus in a little bit more on the particular ones that Canada is involved with. As Mr. Harvey said, the agreements, the international agreements, really pretty on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies really trace back to the G20, and then a few months later the APEC. And the language was really very specific, which was to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that contribute to wasteful consumption. So you can see that there's all kinds of qualifying terms in there. I was participated in some of the, as an observer in some of the discussions among the G20 members after the statement was issued in September 2009. And of course, one of the first things they wanted to do was to say, well, what are we defining as a subsidy? And they never got agreement. So which was a bit of a pity. Go forward several years, and they were reporting their subsidies on a bit of a piecemeal basis annually, but at least it kept going. And there was the decision to have these peer reviews. And those started in 2016 with China and the United States, and it was followed by Germany and Mexico, and then Indonesia and Italy. I had the privilege of actually chairing all 6 of those peer reviews, and one of the reasons that I think that they picked the OECD, which I was working for at the time, was that its database was very detailed, and so whereas other information sources are really you produce just basically very large single numbers by fuel, the OECD database was actually identified individual policies and quantified those policies. And by the way, the ISD was engaged as a consultant on in helping to produce the numbers for several of these the countries in the database, including Canada. So let me just show you what that involves. So I'm going to share my screen here, and okay. So so basically, when 2 countries decide that they're going to undergo one of these reciprocal peer reviews, they usually there's some background discussions, and then they announce it usually at one of the G20 meetings. So when Argentina and Canada decided to pair up, they announced this at one of Argentina's meetings in 2018. And so then there's this period of terms of reference. Now, really there's a bit of inertia with this, in that the original terms of reference that are agreed upon by between China and the United States have pretty much provided the template for the subsequent ones. There's no requirement that they do, but let's say there's that tendency to go on that. So then what they do is they produce their self-reviews. And this is a document where they say, okay, these are what we see as our subsidies. Now they're supposed to make a distinction between what they see as efficient and inefficient. So for example, in the original, in the United States self-review, they'd identified most of their subsidies as inefficient, but then they separately identified the ones that were to help low-income families pay for their electricity and fuels as not coming into that category. And one of the things that I think is useful about this exercise, even though the OECD has collected data on all these countries, is it's gotten some of them to really look much more deeply and bring to light subsidies that the OECD was not able to find. And so in China, for example, they in their self-report, they brought to light a number of tax-related support, and unfortunately, they weren't able to quantify them. But I mean, they were quite open about that, and said we didn't really have a system in place for producing tax expenditure reports. It's something we obviously need to do and we want to do. So then they nominate a review team. It's really up to the countries to decide who's on that. They might take some recommendations from the OECD, but it's really up to them. And then usually there's a large degree of overlap of membership of the review teams. But again, it's not a one-for-one. So they usually are other G20. Initially, they were only other G20 countries. And then New Zealand was invited in to participate in the Mexico and German ones. And then it was, and there are various other intergovernmental organizations besides the OECD have been brought in. So the IMF on China's review, for example, and then with Italy and Indonesia, the review teams expanded even more. The World Bank, for example, was involved. And then also the IISD in the case of Indonesia, and the IISD plus several other ones in the case of Italy. So then the challenge for the OECD or whoever's chairing it is to then work in an iterative process with the members of the team and with the country, develop questions and answers, send them around to the countries, and then usually the answers from the countries to those provide the starting basis for the discussion that in the past was done in in-person meetings. I don't know what the schedule is for Argentina and Canada and whether they're going to do theirs virtually. I mean, I'm no longer working for the OECD. I retired at the end of November 2018. But oh yeah, one other thing I should say is, of course, the other country is always a member of the review team. So country 2 would have a person or persons in the review team of country 1 and vice versa. So then again, the way it has been up to now is the secretariat, the OECD secretariat, writes a draft report that's sent around to the review team. Once there's agreement among the review team members, then it's sent around to the countries for reaction. There's an iterative process there, and then eventually everybody agrees on everything, and it's published. So you can imagine all these steps. It takes some time, particularly since also the OECD decided to take this on in addition to all the other work it was doing. So these tended to take at least a year between the original agreement to start it and the final publication of the report. I've taken a lot of time already. Just other thing I should say is that all G7 countries are members of the G20, so there's not a G7 peer review process. There is a separate APEC peer review process, but the tacit agreement seems to have been that if a country is a member of the G20, they do it through the G20. If they're a member of APEC but not the G20, they do it through APEC. I mean, the question and answer session, I can also address the listener's question about what the definition of the subsidy. For the most part, in the G20 peer reviews, they've been looking at the kinds of support that the OECD has in its database. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Ron.
Stop share.
There we go. Great. So we're going to move to a moderated Q&A right now and for about the next 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a wider audience. But I just wanted to pick up on this theme of the G20 peer review and kind of assess where we are in Canada at the moment. So last summer, Environment and Climate Change Canada did some open consultations with a number of different groups, including environmental groups in Canada, to assess their non-tax subsidies, of which they're in charge of for the review, Finance Canada being in charge of tax subsidies. Then COVID hit. We haven't really heard a lot of updates about the review. Suffice to say, it's behind schedule by comparison to other countries' timelines. So I wanted to ask you, Kat, what we're looking for out of this review, and then maybe pass it over to Ron to get a sense of how we can maybe push for further progress on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, to put it simply, we're looking for transparency around Canada's fossil fuel subsidies. So, You know, you mentioned, Vanessa, when you were kind of opening the webinar that, and we did that initial poll on, you know, what participants think our current fossil fuel subsidies are at. And everyone had a different answer because none of us really know, right? We can do the number crunching that we are able to do with publicly available data, but that data is weak in some instances or absent in others. And it takes a tremendous amount of work on the part of amazing policy analysts like Vanessa, like Bronwyn, and others who we get to work with to figure out what that all means. And ultimately, we need our government to be telling us that information in a coherent and a transparent way. I've noticed in the Q&A that people are pointing out the fact that there is a jurisdictional issue around subsidies in Canada, and that is of course true. There are subsidies that are levied by the federal government. There are subsidies levied by provincial and territorial governments. The extent to which, you know, the federal government's commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies can compel the provinces to do the same phase out is somewhat limited because of provincial and territorial jurisdiction over energy. However, we have also got those really brilliant policy analysts on our team doing that number crunching at the provincial level. And you know, we have these mini versions of fossil fuel subsidy reform campaigns happening in provinces and territories across the country. So with the peer review, we're trying to get to a place where we can all kind of get on the same page as to what subsidies there are, where we have, you know, the security of the peer review part of it. So Argentina coming in and saying, okay, we're kind of checking your work, the dialogue that it creates between the two countries about what subsidies are. And then I guess we're also supposed to get a definition of what an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy is out of it. Although, like, from my perspective, I would challenge governments to tell me what an efficient fossil fuel subsidy looks like.
Thanks. And Ron, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts about how that about that tricky little word, inefficient.
Oh yeah, I'll try to provide a link to the peer reviews on the OECD webpage, but what happened after the second round of peer reviews, there was a big difference in opinion between Mexico and some of the members of the team as to what constituted inefficient. And so what happened was we just realized, well, we have no guidance. That is the team members. And so if you look at both the Mexico and the German reports, there's basically this preamble that we wrote that explains that the G20 has never really defined what are the criteria for whether a subsidy is efficient or inefficient, and also but also sets out about how some other economists and tax experts in the past have talked about the issue. So we really basically set out, under what kinds of limitations we're working with. And I certainly agree with Catherine that there have been other countries which have taken the attitude that, well, we think this is a redundant term. We don't. Why is this even here? I mean, you can imagine the negotiations. I wasn't party to the original G20 negotiations, but these kinds of words are very, very carefully negotiated. And my guess is that there were some less, more developing countries, members who wanted to leave this open. And that's how that got in there. On this issue of to use a generic term, subnational subsidies. I don't know what will happen in the case of Argentina and Canada, but the pattern seems to have been set with the original two, with China and the United States, and so also one thing that was unique, and certainly at the time with the OECD database, was it was the only one that looked at subnational measures and not just national measures. And so one of the parties was very keen on looking at the subnational, well, both parties were very keen at looking at the subnational measures in each other's, but in terms of the practicality, and both wanted to get their reports done quickly, they realized that actually getting agreement among all their subnational parties, in the case of the United States, it would have been 50 states, or at least a goodly part of that, they would have taken any interest in this. They just decided was logistically impossible. So that we got to Mexico and Germany. Both are also federal countries. We didn't really, we talked about it a little bit in the reports, but there was no discussion with people from the individual subnational governments. So, and I mean, with Argentina and Canada, it's the same thing, with very strong provincial autonomy on these kinds of things. So one can hope that they might find some way to talk about this in more detail, but yeah, based on past precedent, I wouldn't get your hopes up too high.
Thanks, Ron, which just demonstrates that we have a lot more work to do to address the billions of subsidies in Canada that occur at the provincial and territorial level. So I just want to broaden the scope a little bit in terms of the intersection between fossil fuel subsidy reform and COVID recovery. So we have this instance right now where governments are pretty strapped for cash, have a lot of pressure to spend a lot of money, and we have some significant amounts of money tied up in subsidies. So I just wanted to ask Martin, and others feel free to weigh in as well, about how COVID responses can ensure that new subsidies are not introduced, and if there's opportunities during our COVID responses to accelerate that subsidy phase out.
I mean, I think countries have to move to the kinds of steps that some have taken, that New Zealand is aiming to do now. You have to lock in your objectives and lock in this peer review. I mean, we're doing it through a climate commission, but I think governments, this is going to take decades, and so governments have to be held accountable, and we can't afford flip-flop in policies. And we have to aim for coherence. So the situation now is that many countries are trying to price emissions, but they're also subsidizing at the same time. So they have to have a plan which is coherent. I mean, phase out subsidies as quickly as possible with a plan, then and work at the same time to price emissions in a proper way. So we've started to do this. I mean, Canada is aiming to do that, but clearly there's a lot of resistance to this here in Canada. I mean, there's another way that, and this is possibly one of the harder things to do, and it takes real political commitment, and that is try to keep your fossil fuels in the ground. In New Zealand in 2018, the government, for example, ended the granting of permits for new offshore oil and gas exploration. So this decision was only a start. We haven't banned the extraction of fossil fuels. We couldn't at the moment stop successful companies exploiting a new find if they have an existing license, but they'll need to take any investment decisions in the context of where New Zealand is heading. So, I mean, the government has taken a careful step in this direction because it's tried to balance existing jobs, but also needing to inform future investment decisions, and also a planned and measured transition to a cleaner energy future. And it's quite hard. It did take some people by surprise. There was strong community resistance, reaction in the area concerned. The government, overall, in going forward, will take a hit in revenues because there are royalties that accrue to the government from our oil and gas industry, and there's concern, obvious concern in the region, concerned about high-paying jobs. It's an industry that does pay well, but you know, New Zealand has, the government has decided it has to have this conversation. It started a national conversation on how we have a just transition towards the phase out of the use and the exploitation of oil and gas. It held a summit, transition summit, to get people together to debate this. And in response, the region concerned has produced its own vision and plan for where they want to head by the year 2050. And now that broad plan is being brought together into a more detailed roadmap. And that conversation is continuing with workshops and dialogue with groups in that particular region. That's a hard thing for governments to do, but if the goals are articulated, if governments make a commitment and can demonstrate that commitment to supporting those people affected, we believe that this can be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. And I think that raises some really good points, especially about, you know, phasing out subsidies is one thing, but the next step is actually making a concerted effort to stop producing and stop exploring. And so I wanted to pass it over to Bronwyn to kind of maybe to talk about the work that Oil Change International is doing on that topic. But also if you have reflections on the speech from the throne that we saw last week, which had a lot of positive and environmental statements in it. And then, you know, we saw a new subsidy be introduced. For those of you who haven't seen, $320 million was announced to support the Newfoundland offshore oil and gas sector. And maybe you can also speak about that tension for just transition in Canada.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I think overall it's like this kind of massive gap between the rhetoric of government right now and the actions we're seeing is definitely like nothing new. We, you know, have had this administration be in power for 5 years and make a lot of promises on this agenda, and then, you know, continue to see really big numbers and really scary packages, you know, continue to happen. And so I think being really honest that it's part of their agenda, it's not just, you know, some subsidies that they had on the books and have forgotten about, I think is really key. And so I think we're in a space where like lobbying and direct government relations can definitely shift the window of opportunity. And I think there's some small wins that are definitely like from that tactic that are definitely reachable. And so I think things like transparency for Export Development Canada, particularly through targeting the Minister of Trade, Mary Ng. I think things like lessening the amount of money that continues to flow to Trans Mountain is definitely possible through kind of advocacy directly. And I think the kind of some of the we can definitely point back to the promises made in the throne speech for this. But I think what's needed more broadly is really kind of pointing to the work of like great coalitions like the Just Recovery Coalition and really leaning into cross-movement collaboration. And so I think we're clearly in a moment where, you know, so many things need money right now. And so I think we win by you know, really making it politically impossible to continue funding fossil fuels. And I think we do that by teaming up with people pointing to pockets of money elsewhere that are also really troubling and hurting life. So things like defunding the police or stopping the purchase of a $19 billion war jet, or, you know, taxing the richest people in Canada who have made $37 billion in profit since the beginning of the pandemic. So I think by teaming up with those folks and really painting a vision together, that's how we ultimately win this. And I think those smaller wins that I mentioned are like absolutely really important. But I think, yeah, it's a moment where we absolutely need to be doing both. And I think because we're in this kind of moment of chronic crisis, this kind of vision building and world building space is where we can do the most, because I think things can actually really shift really quickly right now.
Thanks, Bronwyn. So we're going to slowly transition to a Q&A. So if you have questions as an audience member, please type them in the Q&A and we'll be happy to answer them as you're thinking of your questions. I'm also going to put up one last poll regarding the trends internationally we're seeing around subsidy reform. Okay, so I am pleased to inform you that in fact we have 42 countries worldwide that have implemented some sort of fossil fuel subsidy reform over the past 5 years. And if you're interested in that, you can check out IASD's blog. We do have a blog about this. So what's interesting is that internationally, you know, we haven't gotten into the nuances of different types of subsidies, but we do have different types. You know, there are subsidies that provide support to fossil fuel producers or support for production. And then there's also subsidies that support consumption of fossil fuels. And that includes like tax breaks for consumers. It can, in many developing countries, have supports that reduce the cost of natural gas use, for example, or LPG. So many of those countries from that number of 42 are actually developing countries. But suffice to say that this isn't something that's entirely new. There is already some movement, so we just need to keep pushing Canada along. Before I jump into the Q&A, there was one question that was raised about subnational subsidies, and I just wanted to quickly share a slide outlining subsidies in Canada. So I mentioned we're around 4.8 billion of what we are able to quantify at IASD, and then this slide helpfully outlines how much that could pay for in terms of education, healthcare, and job training. In fact, this number is arguably higher. But you'll see that actually federally, of that 4.8 billion, only 600 million are federal. And I would mention, of course, that we don't actually have all the numbers federally in terms of the tax measures, as well as some of the support that's harder to quantify related to Trans Mountain Pipeline and some of the Export Development Canada funding that Bronwyn mentioned. But in fact, the vast majority of subsidies in Canada are happening at the subnational level. And this is, you know, outsized in oil producing regions like Alberta and BC, but also populous regions like Ontario and Quebec that have large populations. Those subsidies are largely consumer subsidies. So, you know, fuel tax exemptions is a very common one for aviation and railway and farmers. And there's a number of other ones as well. There's some subsidies to support consumers of fossil fuels that are using natural gas, for example. So I'm just going to stop that share. Oh, did I stop it? I actually can't.
We didn't actually see it.
Oh, good point. Okay. I'm just going to pop that up. My apologies. Okay. Please tell me that this is working.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So yeah, so on the right hand side, you can see kind of the levels that we're seeing across Canada. And I would say that, you know, in Canada, the federal subsidies we're seeing are largely for the production of fossil fuels, and many subnational jurisdictions. So this includes Ontario and Quebec, and, you know, classic consumer subsidy are subsidies to support diesel use in remote and northern communities. These are a really good example of subsidies that need to be phased out in a way that supports transition for communities and supports energy independence. And there's many co-benefits as well to phasing these out if they are replaced in a proper way with renewable energies and opportunities for communities to be self-sufficient. But we also have a lot of subsidies at the subnational jurisdiction that are supporting production as well. And largely the vast majority of those in Alberta and BC, as well as Saskatchewan and Newfoundland are related to production. So given that question, I'm gonna, I see 2 new questions have popped up in the chat. So the first one is, what are some things that our governments can do right now in terms of tangible actions while working towards eradicating fossil fuel subsidies? This is a broad question, so I invite anyone who's interested to answer. Otherwise, I will pick you. Kat, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll hop in. I think that Bronwyn actually outlined a few tangible steps that we could take already in the last question that she answered during the moderated session. And I just want to move a little bit into talking about like what this means for people. So a big part of the equation, a necessary element of the equation of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies in Canada in particular, is thinking about the energy transition and its implications for workers and communities. Because we often see that fossil fuel subsidies are justified by saying, well, these are going to help workers. We actually saw that very recently when Minister of Natural Resources Minister O'Regan announced $320 million for Newfoundland offshore oil and gas and said this money is going to help workers in Newfoundland and also help the offshore industry in Newfoundland do some greening of their practices. And it was great to hear the minister say that those were the priorities that he had set for this huge investment. But then, of course, that huge investment was handed over to the provincial government in Newfoundland with no strings attached. And so there's no guarantee that that money is in fact going to go to help workers and help those industries have more green practices. And that's why we put forward the report that we called Green Strings in partnership with IASD and a bunch of other organizations, because we said a really concrete thing that governments have to do is to put conditions around investments that they are making in the private sector so that those investments are leading to the positive outcomes that care for people that we need, that care for people and the planet, I should say. So that's a really big element of it, right? That we need to be seeing governments put more conditions around their investments, even when those conditions are going to fossil fuel companies, when those investments are going to fossil fuel companies, they will likely still be earmarked as fossil fuel subsidies for our own internal calculations, but we have the ability to understand the ways in which those kinds of subsidies, if they have the right conditions, might actually be helping that energy transition in a way that's helping people. I think it's important to note too that there's a sequence, right? There are some subsidies that are more harmful than others. Vanessa just outlined the kind of main division between subsidies, production subsidies versus consumption subsidies. Some consumption subsidies, if they were ripped away tomorrow, it would harm people. And so we need to be thinking about not only the conditions that we're putting on investments being made into the private sector, but also the sequence that we're going to eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsidies by. And in determining that sequence, we should be front loading the most harmful production and exploration subsidies for elimination at the beginning. And then finally, I just want to, and I saw this, I'm going to segue a little bit into a great question from Jamie. We've heard a lot about just transition. So, during the last election in Canada, we had the promise from the Liberals for a Just Transition Act. This was building on the work of the Just Transition Task Force for Coal Workers and Communities that the federal government launched a number of years ago when our Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth accelerated the phase out of coal-fired electricity in Canada, and workers were of course going to be impacted by that. And this task force, which was one of the first national task force of its kind in the world, did amazing work going into those communities, figuring out what they needed, helping to hear what they need to transition, and making recommendations to the federal government of investments that could be made into those communities to help them transition. And we need to be having that conversation on a much larger and proactive scale about what this means for energy workers in Canada and the communities that rely on them, noting that it isn't just climate policy that's affecting those workers. In fact, they are being much more affected by the move to automation, the volatility in global oil and gas markets, and the rise of the gig economy. It's, in fact, climate action is, last on the list of the things that is impacting those workers. But we're unfortunately in a position right now where for decades we've been told that we need to associate our own personal well-being and the well-being of our communities with the well-being of private corporations. And we need to reject that. That is broken, right? And I think if there's anything that this pandemic has revealed, it's number one, that our health and well-being is inextricable from the health and well-being of natural ecosystems. So we must care for those ecosystems in order to care for ourselves. And number two, our personal dignity and prosperity should be guaranteed beyond the prosperity of private sector interests. It's time for us to decouple that association with our health and well-being from the success of profits in the private sector, right? And so while, we're talking about eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and the managed decline of the fossil fuel industry in order to respond to the climate crisis, we're not talking about hurting people, because we can protect people and make sure that they are given the resources that they need to thrive while we eliminate these harmful subsidies.
Thanks, Kat. We have one more question in the chat, and then we're going to move to closing statements. Regarding renewable energy subsidies that have been challenged under the WTO. Ron, if you happen to know the answer to this question, Phil just messaged me the answer, but I'm sure you know, and whether or not any fossil fuel subsidies has been challenged, and maybe the effectiveness of that kind of forum to deal with some of these.
Yep. In fact, I was typing up a message, but the renewable energy subsidies that have been challenged have mostly been associated with local content requirements, which are prohibited. Otherwise, I mean, when you look across the world, most have not been challenged. That's the challenges of the WTO aren't so much the problem as the anti-dumping and anti-subsidy actions, which have been much more commonly used, and throwing very, very high tariffs on specific producers in specific countries, and generally China's been the target of those. A couple of years ago, I and a couple of colleagues looked at that question of, well, have fossil fuel subsidies ever been challenged? And I could find none. And not only that, but there had never been any anti-dumping or countervailing duty cases brought. Anti-dumping is for against dumping, charging lower for what you export than what you charge internally, and the countervailing duties are against subsidized production. And there had been one case in the United States charging several countries with subsidies. It was brought by some smaller producers, but basically the way these kinds of actions take place is that you have to have support from the industry itself, and of course, the weighted, the majority on a weighted average. Sorry, that's not the term I want, but anyway, that are the multinationals, and of course multinationals have a disincentive to challenge other country subsidies, because A, they're probably benefiting from them themselves, and B, they don't want to establish bad blood with other countries that they might benefit from the subsidies in the future. So it's not worked very. Still, as far as I know, there's not been any countervailing or anti-dumping ones against the fossil fuel. The big problem for renewable energy in cases related to fossil fuels, for example, is that these kinds of disputes can only take place when the products are, by the trade terms, like. So there are certain criteria what defines like products, but for example, you would not expect a solar panel to be considered to be a like product with coal. And so, and in a country that tried to bring a case, because some other who was an exporter of solar panels to try to bring a case and said, well, this country is subsidizing coal-fired power through cheap coal imports. The WTO would say you have no standing. They're different products. So yes, I think that there are certain kinds of support that could be challenged, and the Stockholm Environment Institute has looked at some of the ones that that they think could be, but I'm not having high hopes, especially not in this climate at the WTO. On the other hand, there is, as the High Commissioner mentioned, this plurilateral agreement to try to discipline fossil fuel subsidies, and I think that's I give that much more chances, at least in the short term.
Thanks, Ron. Our panelist, Bronwyn, did have to jump off, so we're going to move to closing statements, but I'm just going to read hers from the chat. She would like to reiterate what she added in the question period, that we can win on fossil fuel subsidies and just transition more broadly by collaborating across movements and pointing to what the life-giving things these subsidies can support instead. We are now likely entering a prolonged period of chronic crisis with the fallout of COVID, escalating climate impacts, and the rise of the far right here and internationally. We cannot emphasize enough that this is not business as usual, but things can change very quickly right now. So for those of you in the audience who are NGO staffers, what is most important is doing what you can from your roles to support the growth of a grassroots organizing infrastructure, take risks, step outside of your individual and formal mandates to do so. For those of us that are working on fossil fuel subsidy research, making sure that our numbers and research are accessible to people on the front lines of movements, to replicate things like the West Virginia's teachers' strike, where public sector unions called for ending to coal and oil subsidies to pay for education. Sounds like a great idea to do in Canada. So thanks, Bronwyn, for those comments, and I'd like to pass it on to Martin for any closing comments.
I'd just like to say, I think those comments from Bronwyn were spot on, and I just wanted to touch a little briefly on what Ron had said too about potential action in the WTO. I mean, I think there's clearly a need for action to reform the WTO and get it back onto a track where it's really doing some meaningful things for people in the international trading system and the international economy as it has in the past. But New Zealand, I mean, we believe for a long time that trade and the environment can be made mutually supportive, but it has to address, an organization like the WTO has to address an issue like this, where clearly the international trading system, the international economy is awash with this form of subsidization. I think the thing is we don't really know, we've never really focused on the impact that it's actually having on important economic decisions. As Ron pointed out, fossil fuel subsidies haven't really been challenged. So what we would like to do, working with other countries, is build a coalition to have this put on the WTO agenda, focus in on the dual wins that will come from addressing this, which is for the international economy, but also for the environment, if we get to the point of properly pricing emissions in what we do. One of the areas where at least this is starting to be seen as something that WTO should do is fisheries subsidies. There is a current negotiation on these environmentally very harmful subsidies, which have no rational basis whatsoever, and they hurt as many people as they pretend to support. There are ways of supporting, as a sort of a parallel, artisanal fishers, local fishermen, traditional fishers, without having and allowing the widespread subsidization of global fisheries fleets. So there's a kind of a parallel there. There is action at the moment in the WTO. If we work together, we could also bring this kind of negotiation into the WTO at the end of the day. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And it's been such an honor to have you join us. Ron, did you have any closing comments to add? He's good. Okay, Kat, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thanks. I mean, Bronwyn spelled it out so articulately, and I really take a lot of inspiration from her words. Also, I think really, really important to reflect on what this means for the kind of international or multilateral order, right? So how do we actually not only think about this from a domestic level, but how do we get those macroeconomic shifts that are gonna ultimately push and then support the domestic level transformations that we need? So I think what I'm gonna do, given that folks have said a couple of the points that I might have made, is just talk about like some of the things that we've learned in this pandemic. And I think one of the biggest takeaways that we can sit with on the heels of COVID-19 is the affirmation that there's a real myth that in times of crisis, we divide amongst ourselves. When in fact, time and time again, we see that crisis actually brings us together. And there's a real human instinct for unity in the face of adversity, for coming together to creatively problem solve. And where and when those divisions occur, it's when the responses to the crisis entrench the divisions that are already harming our lives and our communities. And I think that's part of the conversation that we're having here today. We're saying, let's not let the knee-jerk response to this crisis be ramping up fossil fuel subsidies, ramping up unnecessary accommodations for the private sector that will continue to harm our lives and our communities. Because we know that there are forces who benefit from the status quo, and they've been lining up to ask governments to do just that, to double down, to divide and conquer, to provide unnecessary subsidies, to provide unnecessary regulatory rollbacks. We saw the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers on the front end of this pandemic send a letter to the federal government asking for the elimination of over 100 regulations, basically every environmental regulation you could name, plus regulations dealing with the respective Indigenous rights, plus asking the federal government to scale back on their lobbying registry requirements. So we've been seeing, you know, forces of the opposition kind of line up to ask for those accommodations, but we've also been seeing the solutions. And I think that's the thing that we need to really focus our energy on, is understanding that we are in this together and we have the solutions to build a better world.
Thanks. This has been a really great words and wise words from all of our panelists today. So I want to thank you so much for participating, and to those of you who attended, I hope that you found this useful and insightful. Quick reminder, if you want to follow any updates on subsidies in research in Canada, you can check out IASD's Global Subsidies Initiative, as well as the Energy Policy Tracker website, which we update every week. And if you have any questions at all with the webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I will end it there. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Al.